Ryan Cooper stood outside his barn, the cold morning air biting at his skin. As the sun barely touched the horizon, a strange flicker of light caught his attention. The barn's lights flickered again, 3 times that week, a pattern too consistent to ignore. His prized cow, Bessie, let out an irritated moo, clearly upset by the recurring issue. It wasn't just the lights. Something was draining his electricity, like a parasite, leeching off his hard work. Ryan clenched his jaw. His patience was wearing thin. A deep breath filled his lungs as he scanned the surrounding area. No sign of wildlife or faulty equipment. It was something else, something more sinister. It was clear now, someone had to be stealing his electricity. He could feel the tension in his shoulders as the thought solidified. Carla Stevens, that woman, the self-appointed queen of the HOA, was no stranger to causing trouble. For the past 2 years, she had harassed him, accusing him of everything from an unkempt lawn to the unsanctioned animals on his land. Ryan wasn't even part of her HOA, but that didn't matter to her. She had to control everything. As he walked out onto his porch, his eyes narrowed. His heart skipped a beat as he saw it. An orange extension cord, snaking across the fence and into Carla's property. Ryan's fists clenched as the reality hit him. There it was, the blatant theft. His property, his power, being siphoned away without a second thought. And Carla, she had the audacity to think she could get away with it. His blood boiled, but he knew he had to stay calm. Charging over there and confronting her head-on would only make things worse. Instead, he needed proof. Cold, hard evidence. His mind worked quickly, moving from frustration to a calculated strategy. With a firm resolve, Ryan grabbed his hunting camera, setting it up in the barn to record the next time Carla came sneaking onto his land. The trap was set. Now, it was just a matter of waiting. The next morning, Ryan sat down with his coffee, his eyes glued to the screen of his phone. As he watched the footage from the hunting camera, a slow grin spread across his face. There she was, Carla Stevens, in her oversized yoga pants and that tacky, bedazzled hoodie, sneaking onto his property like a burglar in the dead of night. Her movements were cautious, almost exaggerated, as if she believed she was some master thief. The audacity of this woman. It was almost too much to believe. She'd actually looked around before plugging in her extension cord, completely unaware that the camera was recording her every move. Ryan's hands clenched into fists, a surge of anger rising in his chest. He was moments away from storming over to her house. But then a thought struck him. Why rush? Why not make this more interesting? He could confront her now, but the satisfaction of watching her squirm later was much sweeter. This wasn't just about getting her off his property, it was about turning the tables on her, showing her that no one, not even her, was above the law. His mind raced with possibilities. There was only one thing to do. He needed proof. Cold, irrefutable proof. So Ryan spent the day testing his electricity. Every time he flicked a switch or turned off the power in his barn, he saw the spikes in his meter. Carla's house continued to run smoothly, as if nothing had changed. Lights on, air conditioning running, and those obnoxious flamingo lawn ornaments glowing in the dark. His blood boiled as the evidence mounted up. By the time the sun set, Ryan's plan was crystal clear. It was time to take action. He sat down, his fingers flying over the keyboard, crafting the most terrifying, official-looking letter he could manage. The words were carefully chosen, designed to instill panic in anyone who read them. When it was finished, it looked like something straight out of a bureaucratic nightmare. Ryan leaned back, satisfied with his work. The letter was perfect. Carla wouldn't stand a chance. Ryan's heart raced with anticipation as he watched the delivery driver drop the envelope at Carla Stevens' doorstep. He leaned back in his chair, a grin playing on his lips, savoring the moment. This was it. Carla, the queen of the HOA, would soon realize that the rules she loved to impose on everyone else were about to be turned back on her. Carla stepped outside in her usual queen of the block outfit. A floral robe, fuzzy slippers, and a face that seemed to constantly scrutinize the world. Her eyes locked on the letter, and as soon as she saw the bold final notice, stamped in red across the envelope. Her expression shifted. Ryan could see her jaw tighten from where he stood on his porch. She picked up the letter with trembling hands, as if it were a ticking bomb. He could already imagine the panic setting in. The moment she tore the envelope open, her face drained of color. Ryan's breath caught in his throat as he watched her frantically scan the paper. Then, just as he had predicted, the shriek echoed through the neighborhood, a sound of pure terror and disbelief. Birds took flight, startled by the sudden noise, and Ryan fought to hold back a laugh. Carla stumbled backward, clutching the letter like it was a court summons. She rushed inside, no doubt scrambling to draft an angry email or make frantic phone calls. Ryan couldn't help but feel a rush of satisfaction. He had her exactly where he wanted her. Panicked, desperate, and completely out of control. His phone buzzed. It was Carla, of course, but Ryan didn't answer. He let it ring, letting the tension build. Every moment she spent lost in a frenzy was a victory. In the distance, he could see Carla pacing around her front yard, letter still in hand, like a trapped animal. Her frantic movements were a mix of outrage and fear. It was a beautiful sight. Ryan's hands were steady as he took another sip of his coffee. She thought she could dominate everyone with her rules. Now, she was the one at the mercy of them. Hours passed, but Ryan didn't budge. He watched from his porch as Carla, still visibly shaken, clutched the letter in her hands. The frenzy that consumed her was almost comical. Every so often, she would glance out the window, scanning the neighborhood as if hoping someone might come to her rescue. But no one came. She was alone in this. It wasn't long before Mike Stevens, Carla's long-suffering husband, emerged from the house. His face, a picture of tired indifference, told Ryan everything he needed to know. Mike had probably been dragged into this mess, just as he had been countless times before. He didn't even look surprised when Carla shoved the letter at him. He skimmed it with a deep sigh, muttering something under his breath, then turned around and walked back into the house. Clearly, he had no interest in engaging in whatever imaginary war Carla was waging this time. Ryan chuckled under his breath, watching the whole exchange. It wasn't long before Carla's desperation reached a new level. She stormed to her printer, printed out several pages, and began frantically scanning them for something, anything, that could help her fight back. Ryan leaned forward in his chair. This was the moment he had been waiting for. With a deep breath, he stood up. It was time for the next phase. He had one final move left, one that would ensure Carla couldn't escape her own trap. His phone rang again. This time it was Eric Thompson, his friend and the man who had helped craft the fake notice. "She's losing it," Eric laughed on the other end. Ryan grinned. It's almost too easy. As Carla gathered a small group of her loyal followers, including a few neighbors who still, for some inexplicable reason, trusted her, Ryan felt a strange sense of calm wash over him. He had already won. She had already lost. All he had to do now was sit back and watch her self-destruction unfold. Carla's loyal army approached, each of them with that look of doubt creeping into their eyes. They didn't know it yet, but they were about to witness the final act of this thrilling showdown. And Ryan? He was ready. Ryan stood at the edge of his porch, a sense of calm washing over him. He could see the group of neighbors, led by Carla Stevens, making their way down the driveway. Their faces were a mix of confusion, doubt, and reluctant loyalty. They were following Carla, but the uncertainty was palpable. Ryan's eyes narrowed as he watched them approach, all of them holding on to some hope that Carla would somehow find a way to wriggle out of this mess. Carla, in her usual commanding way, marched up the driveway, holding the letter high in the air as though it were her shield. Her followers trailed behind her, their expressions flickering with anxiety. As they neared Ryan's front gate, she stopped, her eyes blazing with defiance. "Do you have any idea what this is?" she snapped, thrusting the letter toward Ryan. Her voice was shaking, but there was still that familiar arrogance behind it. Ryan took his time, pretending to read the letter, acting as though he had no idea what she was talking about. "It looks like a power bill," he said, his voice calm, almost too calm. He raised an eyebrow, pretending to scrutinize it more closely. "Expensive one, too." Carla's eyes widened. Her frustration was evident, but she wasn't ready to back down. "This is an outrageous, fraudulent charge. This FAA doesn't even exist," she retorted, her tone rising. Ryan feigned concern, though he couldn't hide the small grin forming at the corners of his mouth. "Oh, but it exists. It says so right there." He pointed to the letter and let the silence hang in the air. Carla's followers exchanged nervous glances, the weight of the situation sinking in. One of them, a woman named Patricia, looked uncomfortable. "I mean, if it's official," she murmured, unsure. Carla whipped around to glare at her, fury blazing in her eyes. "It's a scam. Someone's trying to rip me off." Ryan couldn't resist a small smile. "That's awful. But, just a thought. Didn't you plug into someone else's electricity?" he asked innocently. Carla's face drained of color, her words faltering as she tried to come up with a response. Ryan pulled out his phone and hit play. The camera footage from his barn flashed onto the screen. The footage was damning. Carla was caught red-handed, dragging the extension cord across his property like a thief in the night. The silence that followed was heavy, oppressive. Carla stood there, speechless, her loyal followers starting to back away, unsure of how to react. Ryan crossed his arms, a look of quiet satisfaction on his face. "Look, Carla," he said softly, "I'd hate to escalate things, but you might want to just pay the bill and move on." Carla's nostrils flared as she sputtered, "This is ridiculous. I won't pay a fake bill." Ryan's eyes narrowed, but his voice remained steady. "Then, I guess the FAA will have no choice but to take action." The phone call came much sooner than Ryan expected. It was from Carla Stevens, her voice a mix of panic and rage. "This is an outrage," she yelled. "I will not pay this bill. It's a complete fraud." Ryan listened, letting her vent, but he didn't respond immediately. Instead, he watched as she stormed back into her house, the letter still clenched tightly in her hand. He knew this wasn't going to end easily. Carla had a way of turning every situation into a fight. But the game had changed. Ryan's plan was already in motion, and there was no going back now. He knew that if he was going to push her further, he needed to be patient. It wasn't long before Ryan heard the sound of a car pulling up in front of Carla's house. The door slammed open, and he could see Mike Stevens standing there, looking more tired than ever. His face was a blank mask, but the way he looked at Carla told Ryan everything. Mike had been dragged into yet another one of her messes, and it was clear he was done. He barely glanced at Carla before turning and walking inside, shaking his head in disbelief. But Carla wasn't going to back down. She wasn't the type to admit defeat, even when the evidence was staring her in the face. Ryan could see her pacing inside, her mind working furiously to come up with some kind of excuse, some way to get out of this. She wasn't used to losing, especially not to someone like him. Moments later, Carla reappeared outside, this time with a few loyal neighbors in tow. Her followers looked uneasy, glancing at each other as if they, too, could sense the tide was turning against her. Carla held the letter high again, her grip tight. "This is a scam," she shouted, eyes wide with desperation. "This FAA doesn't even exist." Ryan's lips curled into a slight smile. He hadn't expected her to give up so easily. "If it doesn't exist," he said, his voice calm, "then why did you get this notice in the first place?" Carla froze, her face paling as the weight of his words sank in. She had no answer, and Ryan felt the power shift in his favor. He pulled out his phone and pressed play. The camera footage flashed on the screen, revealing Carla sneaking onto his property, plugging in that extension cord like a thief. The silence that followed was deafening. Carla's mouth opened and closed, but no words came out. The truth was undeniable. Her loyal followers, one by one, began to back away, clearly uncomfortable with the situation. Ryan's gaze never left Carla. "You might want to pay the bill, Carla," he said softly, "or things could get a lot worse." The HOA meeting was a spectacle Ryan had been anticipating for days. Word had spread, and by the time the gathering began, there was an almost palpable tension in the air. Carla Stevens stood at the front, trying to maintain her composure, but it was clear she was unraveling. Her usual air of superiority had been replaced with desperation, as she clutched the papers in her hands. The same papers that had nearly cost her everything. Ryan, sitting quietly in the back, watched her as she stood before the room of HOA members. She was trying, almost painfully, to defend her actions. "I did not steal any electricity," she declared, her voice quivering, yet loud enough for everyone to hear. "This is all a scam, a plot to bring me down." Her loyal supporters sat there, shifting uncomfortably, glancing at one another, no longer as convinced as they once had been. Ryan could see it in their eyes. Doubt had crept in. He could feel it too. The power had shifted, and it was only a matter of time before Carla's empire crumbled under the weight of her own lies. One by one, the members of the HOA began to speak up, some still loyal to her, but more and more starting to question her motives. The walls were closing in around her, and she knew it. Mike Stevens, her long-suffering husband, sat at the back, his face a mask of indifference. He had heard it all before. The same excuses, the same promises. He wasn't buying it anymore. And then came the final blow. Gerald "Jerry" Thornton, a longtime member of the HOA who had remained neutral, stood up. "I've had enough of this," he said, his voice clear and unwavering. "It's time we put an end to this nonsense. Carla, you've crossed the line. We can't keep tolerating this behavior. It's time for you to step down." The room fell silent. Ryan watched Carla's face contort as she realized that she was losing the battle. Her eyes flicked nervously around the room, looking for support, but it was gone. The group was done. Her reign had ended. With a heavy sigh, Carla lowered her head. "Fine," she muttered, her voice barely audible. "I resign." It was over. Carla Stevens, the once powerful leader of the HOA, was no longer in control. Ryan felt a sense of triumph. But as he watched Carla leave the room, he couldn't help but feel a deep, almost sorrowful understanding. She had fought so hard to maintain her power, but, in the end, it had been her own actions that led to her downfall. As Carla left the room, the HOA members exchanged relieved glances. Ryan stood, a small smile creeping onto his face. The battle was won, but the war, that, he knew, would continue. The sun was setting over Ryan's farm, casting a warm golden glow across the fields as he stood on his porch, looking out at the peaceful scene. The battle with Carla Stevens was over, and the weight of the last few weeks seemed to lift off his shoulders. His farm had endured, his plans had succeeded, and most importantly, Carla's reign had come to an end. It hadn't been easy. Carla had been relentless, using her position as the HOA president to try and control everyone around her. But Ryan had outsmarted her, playing a game she never thought she'd lose. The satisfaction of seeing her finally step down, resign from the very position she had abused for so long, was more fulfilling than he had anticipated. It was a bittersweet victory, though. Carla had been consumed by her need for control, and in the end, it had destroyed her. Ryan's phone buzzed in his pocket, snapping him out of his thoughts. It was a message from Mike Stevens, Carla's husband. Ryan read it and felt a small smile tug at the corners of his mouth. "I just wanted to say thanks for standing up for all of us. You've done what none of us could. Carla and I are going to take some time to sort things out. I appreciate your patience through all of this." Mike's message was brief but sincere. Ryan had expected some form of thanks, but seeing it in black and white made the victory feel even sweeter. For the first time in years, the neighborhood felt like it could breathe again. The heavy burden Carla had placed on everyone was gone, and Ryan knew he'd played a part in making that happen. As the evening settled in, Ryan walked across his land, the soft rustling of the trees around him creating a peaceful melody. Bessie the cow mooed from the barn, a familiar sound that brought comfort. It was in moments like these that Ryan realized how much he cherished his quiet, independent life, one that now felt all the more secure without Carla's oppressive shadow hanging over it. He didn't need a grand celebration or even a thank you. The peace and freedom he felt were all the reward he needed. As he stood there, looking out at the stars slowly appearing in the night sky, he finally felt at peace. The fight was over, and in the end, justice had prevailed. The story follows Ryan Cooper, A patient and intelligent man who faces the abuse of power by Carla Stevens, the HOA president who is stealing electricity from his farm. Instead of confronting her directly, Ryan meticulously plans to expose her wrongdoing. Through determination and strategy, Ryan strips Carla of her power, not only breaking her dominance, but also bringing justice to the community. The story is a lesson in patience, intelligence, and the power of justice in life.